Wonderful. Well, I think you can all agree that that was an amazing panel to kick things off this evening. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our next panel. We've got Professor David Nutt and Dr. David Erritzoe. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We've been so excited to have this discussion with you both on the promise of psychedelic drugs, which I know is a topic that means so much to our audience here this evening. Unfortunately, David Luke is unable to join us and sends his apologies, so I'll spare you the bad joke about being on a panel with too many Davids.
Call me Dave.
But I knew you were going to say that, Dave. So tonight, we've got Dave and David with us. Now, the list of accomplishments between these leading researchers is so impressive that it was quite difficult to pick out some highlights. And I suppose the intro for Dave, perhaps a bit long, but I think really helpful in terms of fleshing out just why they're so distinguished and prominent in this sector. Now, Professor David Nutt has been the director of Psychopharmacology Unit at Bristol University, also established the Department of Neuropsychopharmacology and Molecular Imaging at Imperial College. He's been the president of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, the British Neuroscience Association, and the British Association of Psychopharmacology. He has published over 400 research papers, 8 government reports, and 27 books. And Dave has a new book right now called Brain and Mind Made Simple.
Tomorrow night, by the way, is the launch, if you want to come. Regent's University.
Which I encourage you all to attend and to buy. Now, Dave is also currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and Director of Neuropsychopharmacology Unit at the Division of Brain Sciences. Dave is also the chair of our beloved Drug Science and president of the European Brain Council. Yes, that's the top brain at an entire council of brains. As well as having been named one of the 100 most important figures in British science, and that was well before the psychedelic renaissance. David Erritzoe is a clinical senior lecturer in general psychiatry at the Centers of Neuropsychopharmacology and Psychedelic Research at Imperial and consultant psychiatrist at St. Charles Hospital. Dr. David is also clinical director at the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, where his research, alongside that of Professor Nutt and Dr. Carhart Harris, is focused on investigating brain mechanisms and the therapeutic potential of MDMA, ketamine, and classic psychedelics. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the esteemed Davids, and we will welcome questions from the audience at the end. And I know you're going to have many of those, so thank you. So I thought we might start with Dave. And perhaps you could explain for our audience here this evening just how the brain reacts to a psychedelic. And perhaps we start with psilocybin or whatever takes your fancy.
I thought it might be useful if we talk about these drugs and separate what you might call the classical psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, which are very well studied now, a lot of it having been done in our team. And then we can also talk about MDMA, which is, of course, also has very interesting therapeutic utility. And Ben, I believe, talked a bit about his trials with MDMA and alcoholism earlier. So they work in quite different ways. So psychedelics, like psilocybin, they directly stimulate a serotonin receptor in the brain. Now, serotonin is a really very important neurotransmitter. It's involved in a whole range of different brain functions. And because it's so important, there are 15 different subtypes of serotonin receptors. But there's one particular one, which is called the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. That is the prime target of psychedelics. And that's how we know, that's why we call them as a class of drug, because they all have affinity for that receptor. They get into the brain, they stimulate that receptor. And that receptor is a very interesting receptor because it's highly expressed in human cortex, particularly in the parts of the cortex that make you human. So the bits of the cortex that have grown massively in evolution to make the human brain bigger than any other primate brain. And that gives us a clue as to why these receptors are important, because the neurons they're on are the neurons which communicate across the brain. And obviously cross-brain communication is vital. Your brain's enormous. There's 200 billion neurons churning away, and they have to talk to each other. And that talking is done by a particular subset of neurons that have these 2A receptors. And when you stimulate those receptors, these neurons fire differently. And in fact, what you effectively are doing with psychedelics is you're breaking down the learnt processes of communication, which in the case of psychiatric disorders are malignant. So in the case of depression, you've got people who are ruminating continuously about things they've done wrong, which they may not even have done. In addictions, you've got people who are continually ruminating about where they're going to get their next fix or their next hit. And those brain processes commandeer their lives. And psychedelics, by stimulating those receptors on those particular neurons, break down those processes and allow people to escape from them. Initially for a short period, but if you do psychotherapy with it, you can kind of relearn a different way of thinking. Now, MDMA works very differently. MDMA works largely, we think, subcortically, not the high levels of cortex, but in the limbic system, the emotional system. And it has a very powerful effect to release serotonin. It also has some effect to release dopamine, and it may have other effects. We heard a talk in the previous session about how the drug laws have made it very difficult to research these drugs. Well, they've not only made it difficult to research these drugs clinically, but they've almost completely closed down all preclinical research on these drugs. So MDMA must be the least studied popular drug there's ever been. There's almost no work trying to understand how it works as a drug. But up to now, we think it's got something to do with releasing serotonin, releasing dopamine in the limbic system. The limbic system is the emotional center. And if you release serotonin in areas like the amygdala, you can suppress emotional responding. And that, we think, is one of the key reasons why people can re-engage with trauma memories and then overcome them and deal with them and escape from them. And that's why we think it's very powerful in PTSD. Was that all right?
It was amazing, Dave. What I found so interesting from the research and the reading is how a psychedelic like psilocybin, for example, can have long-lasting effects months upon months after the drug has left the brain and the body. And I wondered why that was, how far our understanding of this is, and what we need to do to understand more.
Well, the good news is he's going to tell you, because he's got studies going on to look at why that happens. So tell him about the plasticity, David.
Yeah, we actually haven't conducted the studies yet, but we are planning to.
He's waiting for the checks from you all afterwards.
We'll have a conversation later, Dave.
Yeah. I guess we have done a lot of work in the group with different kinds of brain imaging to try and understand the sort of brain correlates of these quite fascinating psychological phenomena that happen with these drugs. But there are obviously many things we don't understand. And also our understanding of, well, the first question of how they work in the brain is in a way limited by the sort of range of the methods we have available. So sometimes in the beginning, some years ago, it was very easy to try and explain what they did in the brain because we knew very little. We only had a couple of studies, our own studies, and a few others. But now there's so many, and in a way, you can take different approaches to explain how they work, depending on whether you take this very psychological explanation model or a very sort of high-level neuroscience conceptual way of trying to explain how they work, or using specific pharmacological imaging methods or functional or magnetic, structural or electrophysiological methods. So we use all these methods and we try to combine them more and more. That's sort of general in neuroscience, to combine the strength of different imaging methods. Some are really good at having temporal resolution, some are very good at structural resolution, some are very good at measuring the actual live pharmacology in the brain. And we combine these methods, and we have now some tools available that will make us hopefully able to find out more about plasticity in the brain. And plasticity is actually that buzzword have already secured a little bit of funding to our center. When first I got a rejection and then used the word plasticity, and then people were like, that's so cool. And then we actually got, so it's a bit of a hyped word and it's a broad thing, but that everything in the brain that has to do with learning and changes obviously is reflected also in changes in the wiring of the brain, the connections, the synaptic connections between the brain cells. And we have some new tools that we can use in the living human brain, molecular brain imaging, to measure these things. So that's something we are going to do now that we're starting to add to what we have been doing, mainly with MRI and EEG, other brain imaging methods, and we are combining them all in new studies that in healthy people, where we are first going to try to measure some of these things with the effects of ketamine. Ketamine is not a typical, not a classic psychedelic. It's a dissociative drug, but have overlapping effects with the psychedelics, and that's licensed and approved for use in depression now as well. It comes from anesthesiology, but has entered into psychiatry. It's a very interesting compound. We are trying to see whether we can apply paradigms with EEG, so the electrodes on the brain, and we have some very interesting paradigms where we can induce and measure plasticity in the brain. Then we are combining that with some molecular attempts to see whether new synapses are forming in the brain tissue with other imaging techniques, and we are doing them all at the same time. And then we're also doing blood markers related to plasticity. So we are having quite a heavy package of all the imaging together to try to better characterize the effects, because obviously single interventions seem to have the ability, at least in some people, to have really long-lasting effects way beyond the presence pharmacologically in the brain. And why is that? One thing is you can speak about it, again, very psychologically, and that's deeply relevant, deeply interesting, but we are interested to find the brain correlates of that, what actually happens in the brain that explains some of these long-lasting effects, changes in personality, changes in symptom presentations, these insights, this new psychological insights, the avoidance turning to acceptance, which is a deeply therapeutically interesting phenomenon. And obviously it's going to be impossible to find specific brain correlates of all these things, but what actually happens in the brain tissue that can explain that. And we have findings already showing that a full dose psilocybin can induce plasticity with some of this, but now we are sort of expanding the imaging package, and some of it is stupidly expensive and quite invasive, so it's difficult to do on a large scale, but we are doing small pilot work and see if we can see signal and try to explain some of the longer lasting psychological effects and see whether some of these changes in the brain is associated with the outcomes that we can measure with scales and symptoms and well-being measures if it's healthy people. So we are doing all that kind of work.
Thank you so much for going into that more deeply for us. One of my questions here was, I wondered how you go about assessing people both pre and post-treatment in order to measure changes in personality traits. And you mentioned some of the scales, and I'm sure you're also devising your own questionnaires that you're using, and I wondered if you could go into that in a little bit more detail for our audience.
Yeah, so personality is a interesting thing. So normally personality, the typical way of understanding and in personality science is to sort of divide it into big five, the big five big traits or domains of personality. And the classic way to examine them is quite simple with a massive scale tool, so questionnaires. But the thing is, a lot of but personality is in a way bit more than personality, because it all relates directly to pathology and different clinical presentations that is represented within the understanding of personality. So sometimes we push personality traits, and then you can discuss whether they're traits or whether they might be more state markers. But if you treat depression, for instance, you do change scores on personality domains such as neuroticism and extroversion, which is two of the big five. And what we see quite specifically with the psychedelics is that they seem to be pushing and increasing scores on openness to other people's ideas, values, aesthetic appreciation, and so on. They're covered by the one of the other big five traits, openness. And the way that we measure is with scales. However, other aspects of personality we can also test with tasks, so psychological tasks related to impulsivity, sociality, altruism, and all that kind of stuff that also is embedded in personality. You can test with tasking. So I think what Simon has been doing and we have been doing is sort of mainly focused on scales, and we can see how these drugs actually push people, which is very interesting because normal personality, in healthy people, personality is quite stable in adult life, but these interventions seem to actually push some of the traits in a sort of bit more altruistic, open, hot potato to say liberal, but yeah, anyway, direction.
I think there's also this phenomenon of becoming more interested in nature, more interested in the outside and less interested in the inside. And that's also quite important in these disorders like depression and addiction. I think the question earlier on to the previous group was, why would psychedelics work across such a range of different disorders? And my answer to that is that they're what we call internalizing disorders. They're disorders in which people overthink things about themselves. They get locked into mental processes like, I'm worthless, I'm addicted, I'm unclean in OCD, I'm overweight in anorexia. Those internalizing disorders, you can think of them as the brain having a particularly irrelevant but compelling thought. You can't break that. And if you can get out of the brain and get to see the bigger picture, then that may be one of the reasons why people maintain wellness, because they've escaped from that internalizing process.
And can I add to so what some of the ambitions in the sort of neuroscience approach to this field is also that one thing is, for instance, we can measure with scales called nature relatedness. So how much do you want to hug a tree, kind of on a scale from 1 to, and that we can see that increases with psychedelics. Not very surprisingly, but it's actually deeply fascinating that it is so consistent with these drugs, that sort of profound sense of unity, belonging to something greater, including very close relation to nature. But we are trying to task that a bit with different ways in the scanner to create, to try to look the neuroscience behind it, whether in the reward system, in the learning system, whether potentially very related to what David is saying, a potentially very narrowed reward spectrum, so that you are over-focused on a very sort of narrowed in spectrum of sort of behaviors and focus. In addiction, it might be super drug seeking. You give up your relations, it falls apart and becomes very hijacked by a specific behavior that takes over your life. In depression, it might be rumination, negative thoughts, and so on. And that rebroadening, that seems to be part of what the psychedelics are doing therapeutically. What is the neural footprint of that? Could it be that we can measure in the learning and reward circuits of the brain by showing people videos of nature, of connectedness, and we're tasking that and testing that at the moment and seeing very interesting things in people with pathological gambling, and then we hope to in the future to apply the treatment models with psychedelics to addictions as well in our team. We have done a lot of addiction work, but not yet with psychedelics at Imperial.
I mean, there are lots of psychedelics that are being discovered, created, and you've touched on various indications that can be treated with psychedelics. I wondered, in your opinion, which psychedelic holds the most promise for particular indications or overall, and why? Or is it a case of, different drugs for different indications, different people?
Well, again, I think this was touched on in the previous panel, but the answer is we don't know, because most of our work, in fact, all of our therapeutic work that's ready to be, or in the public domain, or could be in the public domain, it's been with psilocybin. But David's doing a study of DMT in depression, and we're also setting up studies with 5-methoxy-DMT, and possibly also a study with ibogaine, but that's more targeted at addiction. So up till now, the evidence base is overwhelmingly in favor of psilocybin. I think we can say pretty categorically it works. And we kind of like psilocybin because it's very safe. It's been widely used as magic mushrooms for millennia around the world and for decades in Britain. And the trip lasts 4 to 5 hours, so it's plenty of time for people to kind of get into their mind, get into their past, see where they've come from, see what the problems are, and begin to deal with them. But we may be wrong. It actually may be that his work, giving just a short, sharp slug of DMT for 20 minutes might reset the brain just as well as 5 hours of psilocybin. So time will tell, won't it, David?
And we've seen a number of companies that are looking at how they might develop drugs which originate from psychedelics but actually dial down or completely remove the psychedelic trip. I wondered, what do you make of the value of these? Is there a place for them? Are they beneficial, or is this a case of hype?
Yeah, as Sarah said in the previous bring him on, I mean, and in a way I agree, that I think that was more to the question of making a shorter version or a change to the molecule of the classics and still have the psychological impact and effects. But whether you can change the molecules, I mean, you can easily do that and then get them without any subjective experience of what the value of those will be. Again, I will stay open-minded, because when you could be a massive idiot if you sit here and say that they won't work and then they turn out to actually also work. My guess would be that they might be less powerful, but it should be tested, so it's meaningful to develop. It's logical that pharma and investors are looking in to try to develop drugs that have very shared pharmacology but without that subjective experience. That can be deeply challenging. It's expensive. You need 2 therapists in the room. So, I mean, one thing is testing a short-acting, and when we say short-acting, we don't mean that therapeutic effects is short, because we don't know. Hopefully it's not, then it would be stupid. But with DMT, for instance, it's a very short experience, so that's what we mean when we call them short-acting. So that's one approach, and that's also cost-wise meaningful if that works. It could also be that it might be used as top-ups after initial longer lasting experiences with psilocybin or LSD or something, and then later you can top it up with shorter experiences, maybe. Could also be that in itself, as David's mentioning, that DMT will be powerful. Whether the non-psychedelic drugs that share pharmacology will work, maybe. I mean, because the anti-inflammatory response, the plasticity in the brain combined with psychotherapy might give something on its own. So it definitely cannot be ruled out that they could have some effects. My guess is that it will be smaller effects, so you will need more people, bigger trials to really show the efficacy. They might be incredibly safe, which is great, but time will show, and I can understand why people are testing it. I think we are so in love with the proper psychedelic experience and studying all those. There's so much to study there that we are just cracking on with that. So I don't think we might jump on that bandwagon. I think other people would do it.
I could just add a couple of comments. The first is that there is a whole new discipline of pharmacology called plastogens. People are inventing drugs that make the brain more plastic, and with a view to helping treat all range of disorders, from depression to dementia. And I think that's plausible. I mean, you know, there's no reason why you shouldn't stimulate synaptic growth and brain plasticity with drugs. I'm sure you can. Whether they will have any specific utility in a particular disorder is a bit hard to know, because I mean, I think maybe they work in everything. But I'm with David there on the idea that the great thing about the psychedelic experience is it does give you something to work with and something to change, and it does change your brain, so you can be in a different place from which you can utilize plasticity to kind of reset a whole new way of thinking, which is how I teach it. And then just to comment on the attempts, for the last 20 years, people have been trying to find a non-psychotomimetic ketamine to treat depression, and it's failed. So I kind of think, well, this doesn't. But maybe ketamine's a different drug. You know, who knows? It's not. You know, it's a glutamate blocker rather than a 5-HT agonist. But I suspect, you know, there's a bit of a lesson there. And the final thing I would say, you know, there's a lot of hype. I mean, I think there are companies which have shoved a new analog of psilocybin into a mouse and shown that it doesn't cause a head twitch, but does encourage the mouse to swim when it's thrown into a bottle of water. And they said, well, they've raised $80 million on that, so it's either very gullible, a lot of Americans, or they're right. I just think that there's a long way to go from a mouse twitching its ear to having a therapy in a human.
And may I add that might also, that was part of the reason why in 2008, when there was a financial crisis, a lot of the mental health programs in big pharma companies were shut down, because it's very expensive. And the reason why it's so expensive is that often it fails between that mouse observation of whatever happens in that bottle of water and then how it actually ends up working in humans with something as complex as mental illness. So they often fail. So it's great to be optimistic and happy about the results in these early stage animal models with new compounds, but they often fail.
And it's hard for a mouse to tell you if it's approaching the white light, isn't it, David? So
I've often wondered what is a god to a mouse. I mean, is it a super mouse? I don't know.
Danger mouse, I think. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the microdosing trial, David. It's not something that we invest in our thesis, but a lot of our audience are interested in it and do microdose, and I wondered if you could share a little bit about that, what you can.
But I try not to speak about it because we are so unpopular when we speak about that trial. Actually, one thing just before I might add to the psychoplastogens. I mean, it's a wonderful term, and again, smart, branding of these drugs. But I mean, cocaine creates a lot of plasticity in the brain. It really does, just in the wrong way, in the wrong areas. People become really quite addicted, and that's because of plasticity as well. So I'm just saying, plasticity is, a tricky phenomenon, I would say. But it has to be in the right place, and it has to be used for the right thing. So that window of flexibility psychologically and plasticity in the brain needs to be harnessed and used therapeutically in the smart way. Otherwise, it might not be just inherently good. The microdosing trial, basically, short version, our trial showed that it was placebo. That might be a little bit too simple, but it looked like expectation, and when people were guessing what they were taking in a placebo double-blinded controlled trial, not a normal double-blinded controlled trial. It was a self-blind model where people all over the world could participate via an online platform, following a manual that also ended up being a YouTube video manual that people could follow. And then they basically created a system where they blinded themselves by following this manual. So if they were planning to do microdosing on their own initiative with their own drugs, LSD or psilocybin, typically first it could only be done for practical reasons in our design with LSD, but then we found a way to use bigger capsules, and people could do dried mushroom at home in bigger capsules. Then they put it into small bags with some labels, into some envelopes with some QR codes that they printed out. Then they mixed it in a very specific way, and then they disregarded half of the envelopes and only used half. And the one envelope represented 1 week of microdosing, so they were using 4 envelopes, disregarding 4 envelopes, didn't know whether it ended up being all full of microdoses, all full of placebo. We had a burping bias in that trial because people who did it with mushrooms, when they burped, they could taste the mushroom, so we had to change the protocol and then put in some other mushroomy material into the placebo. And remember, we never met these people. They could be in Buenos Aires, they could be all over the world, but they followed this. It was pretty geeky, enthusiastic psychonauts who were like curious about whether it could actually be a placebo or not. And we had people writing us and saying, I have been on this antidepressant, I suffered this and that, and strong anxiety and depression, and now I did this, and now this is the most powerful thing, it really worked. And we were sitting there looking at the data like, why don't you go in and open the other 4 envelopes? And then all the microdoses were actually in there. So let's not underestimate the placebo effect. So in that trial, everybody improved, okay? People massively improved on all outcomes, but so did they in the placebo group. And also when we then looked at whether, because we also asked people virtual or online whether what they thought they were taking on every day they took a capsule, whether they thought it was a microdose or whether they thought it was in the end of the day. And we could see that the guessing was 10 times more predictive of what was actually in the capsule. So if people thought they took microdose, but they actually had placebo, it worked, and the other way, not so much. So it was more driven by the expectation and the guessing than the actual content. And obviously these were mainly healthy people, but when we looked at a subsample of people who were kind of depressed at baseline, we had all the measures of depression scales and well-being and neuroticism and all that. So we created sort of a little group of depression-like patients and only looked at that same pattern. So that doesn't look super duper promising for the clinical application of psychedelic microdosing. However, this is not a proper randomized trial. So everybody is obviously shooting us down, also people in the space who want to raise investments. And we are not trying to destroy that field. I think it's very important for big trials to be run. So in a way, we shot ourselves in the foot with the results. But hey, I guess that's science. That's science there. Yeah.
And just goes to show how much more investment is needed in this area so that we can keep running trials that will improve. And on the perspective of trials, look, I mean, there have been so many trials, we see it looking at psilocybin. And if you compare the number that are looking at psilocybin versus, for example, LSD, we find that curious. I mean, is that because LSD is such a politically loaded
two
drug?
reasons why LSD is difficult to work with. One is that even what was her name, that Home Secretary who became Prime Minister? Anyone remember her name? Anyway, even she knew she didn't like it. You know, it's politically laden. You know, everyone hates, all politicians hate LSD. So that was why, you know, the reason I was sacked as the government's chief drugs advisor. Where are you? There, I was telling you over. Yeah, it was because I actually dared say on the radio, the holiest of holy programs, the Today program, I said that LSD was less harmful than alcohol, and the world went mad. I mean, truly. That comment was on the front page of USA Today the next day. I mean, it was completely surreal. So people hate LSD because they've told lies about it and they've been hysterical about it forever. But we don't use LSD in our research other than to show the research which we did to show that it actually worked, because the trips are long-lasting, and we have to keep people in overnight if we brought them in. So with psilocybin, we can bring them in the morning and they can go home in the evening. With DMT, you can bring them in the morning and go home for coffee. But with LSD, you have to, and so it becomes very much more expensive and very much more challenging to work with. So those two reasons.
So that's why we're doing Ibogaine next, which is like 3 days.
3 days of trauma for, yeah.
But we're doing Ibogaine next because no one has ever done a brain imaging study on Ibogaine. We don't know. We don't even know if it's a psychedelic. It might be something else. I mean, it's certainly, you know, it's definitely not a normal psychedelic or a classic psychedelic.
And with all the clinical trials that are taking place and the results that we're seeing, do you feel, Dave, that consensus is growing among cognitive neuroscientists that the use of psychedelics is a valid way of studying the mind, or do you still feel that this is a barrier that we have to break down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. We used to have a huge amount of opposition when we tried to publish our papers. You know, you got the most ridiculous comments. You know, we were pitching at the top journals, so they presumably were going to the top experts. And one of them said, "Well, what do you expect if you give? You know, what do you expect if you give psychedelics to the brain?" I mean, well, I would expect to actually know what they did rather than people just saying it's irrelevant. You know, we found alterations in activity, and they just, what do you? I mean, so I think there was 10 years ago a lot of resistance to the idea that these were legitimate tools for studying brain function and consciousness. There's less of that open criticism now, but there's not a lot of people kind of running to us saying, "Can we work with you, please? Can we actually use these tools, which are amazing tools, to understand, you know, many aspects of consciousness?" There are one or two. I think there are some consciousness researchers who do see them as important, but to a lot of people working in that field, both the consciousness field and the cognitive neuroscience field, they're seen as kind of, well, they're drugs anyway. I mean, we only work with thinking. We don't work with drugs. So I think there's still quite a bit of resistance, which is unfortunate because they are amazing tools.
David, anything to add, or should we move to questions? Because I know there are going to be some very interesting questions from our audience here tonight. Are there any questions from our audience here tonight?
The pressure's on.
Okay, well, I think...
I can ask a left field one, which
Good,
is,
Nikki.
we talk a lot about, what's the right word, you know, mental disorders, indications.
Yeah.
Obviously there's broader uses which are being, which you guys may not specifically research, but be more knowledgeable than the rest of us, I suspect. You know, the conflict in Palestine and Israel, for example.
Yes, that's right.
What are your views on, you know, where those are at and the outlook for those?
Yeah, so that study was done by Leo Roseman, who was part of our group, and I think it's enormously interesting, and it would be, well, one of the, when I give talks on this, I always show a slide about the Vietnam War, and that slide shows the anti-war protest, and this was going on in the mid-1960s, and the slide shows someone with a placard saying, "Drop acid, not bombs." And I can't help thinking that was a really good message. If they'd heeded that back in the 60s, and if we heeded it in relation to, say, Syria, we wouldn't have 7 million refugees destabilizing the whole of Europe, effectively. So there's I don't think there's any doubt that psychedelics are better than bombs. Now, I mean, can they help heal people who've got a sort of long-standing or acquired hatred of each other? Yes, if people want to change. So again, I was saying over the dinner, I'm always asked, could psychedelics have made Trump a better person? And my answer is, well, probably not, because psychedelics work if you want to, if you want to change, if you're interested in your mind, or if you're interested in getting better from your mental illness. In fact, there's a horrible possibility it might have made him worse. So I don't think they're a panacea, but if that's possible, I don't think they're a panacea. But on the other hand, I think in the right hands, they could have helped people deal with, long-standing animosities in the same way. And this is where MDMA is really interesting, because why did MDMA become a therapy? MDMA became a therapy not to treat PTSD. It became a therapy initially because Shulgin's wife was a therapist. When he experienced it, he said, this is rather unusual. This is definitely different from all the other amphetamines I've ever taken. And he'd taken more than anyone ever. And he said, this gives you a clarity of thought, but it also gives you a warmth and an empathy. So he gave it to his wife, and they fell back in love. And then she went off and used it in therapy. And for couples counselling, it was widely used to help couples get back together, to get back that feeling of love that they had at the beginning. So, by extrapolation, I think you could use MDMA as well to help facilitate those kind of interactions which are broken down.
Adrienne.
What does your experience of conducting psychedelic research tell you about the state of science today, more generally?
Well, it's certainly the most difficult thing I've ever done. And that's driven largely by the regulations and also the resistance still by the authorities. So what have we created in the last 15 years since we started this research with Robin Carr-Harris? What have we done? We've produced probably half the world's literature on how psychedelics work and the utility of them in depression, certainly. I mean, our depression trials spawned the enormous expansion of clinical research with psilocybin. It's the COMPASS trial was based on our original treatment-resistant depression trials. So it's been enormously productive. What's the government given us? It's given us 1 grant in 15 years. It's turned down 7. The reason Robin's not here, the reason Robin's is in San Francisco, is because every single attempt he made to get money was turned down. And that's, I think, still, it tells us that there's an undercurrent of antipathy to psychedelics that we can't touch, but it's there. It's very easy to turn down grants. You don't have to give explanations. You just turn them down. So it's British science has missed a trick, I think. The Americans now have got many more psychedelic centers than we have, despite Ben's enthusiasm, and we're flying the flag still, David, aren't we? But it's quite challenging, because they have so much more money than we have. I think we have better ideas, and we have extremely good scientists doing them, but we don't have the sort of national institutional support that we should have.
The other day, David entered a meeting with some people in the USA. We have the intellect, you have the money. and I was like, oh, that's embarrassing. But yeah. Anyway, but yeah, you're right. We are cracking on. Yeah.
Well, I guess you had a question.
Yeah, this is a sort of tangential question, but in my reading about psychedelics, something that really struck me, sort of, I guess, lyrically rather than scientifically, was the stone date theory.
Yeah.
And I'd love to put it to kind of esteemed scientists to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, apes like psychedelics too. But whether a lot of psychedelics will turn a chimp into a human is dubious. But I think there is a sort of sliver of truth in it, and that was the point I made in the beginning about there's this peculiar concentration and density of these receptors in the very recently evolved parts of the human cortex. Now, I suspect that's because you need these receptors to basically have a brain as big as ours work properly. So I think, they're kind of a corollary of the brain growth. But I don't think there's any doubt that psychedelics may change the way people see things. I mean, they clearly do. I mean, let's look at, Apple, Steve Jobs didn't invent the biggest company in the world without a little help, and the idea of actually making something that is both functional and beautiful, brilliant construct, isn't it? So Silicon Valley is full of people who are supporting the American studies largely because they've had insights and benefits. So I think it's quite conceivable that through the history of humanity, psychedelic drugs have facilitated insights. And one of the theories we're developing or working on at present is that why are these receptors there? Because they don't do very well. I mean, I started studying the 5-HT2A receptor before he was born, and I wasn't using agonists, I was using anti-blockers. So back in 1984, we did the first human imaging study of blocking the 2A receptor. So the brain's loaded with these receptors. We thought, we've got an antagonist, let's block them, what's going to happen? Nothing happened, except people had deep rhythmic sleep. And actually something happened to me, a little bit happened to me, because I was on them for a couple of weeks, and then I said to my research assistants, I said, well, we finish tomorrow. And they said, please don't stop. And I said, why? And they said, well, you're kind of calmer, David. We can kind of vaguely comprehend what you're saying. Anyway, so they didn't have overt effects, which is paradoxical. So why you can block these receptors and all you get is deep sleep. Now we've done this. Well, now we stimulate them. What do? We get completely fragmented brain activity, the opposite. So we kind of now we know that there's a spectrum of activity across these receptors, which goes from having a lot of effect, which is to fragment EEG activity, to having very little, which allows the brain to become very synchronized. And it's that synchronicity which we think is part of. It's another measure of the brain getting locked into processes which are not very useful. So why are they there then? Are they there just so that you can get the effect of a mushroom? We think probably not. We think they probably have a role at times of extreme relevance. So when you're confronted with a massive challenge, and particularly if you solve the problem of that challenge, if when you're wondering how you're going to break down whatever it is, some cow bone to get the marrow out, and you suddenly discover fire can do that quite well. The remembrance of that and the incorporation of the learning and the communication of that for the next generation, that could be, it's going to be done in those parts of the brain. We've got these receptors, and it may be that the plasticity of those receptors allows people to make these fundamental leaps of consciousness, which essentially, are part of our cultural evolution.
And actually a consistent finding is that, and even more consistent than ever, because last night I heard that they are finding it again in a new method, that neuroticism, so this sort of trait related to anxious, worried, concerned, and a vulnerability marker for affective disorders, depression, anxiety, is related to a high expression of those receptors in human, and that is now being found for the fourth time. And so there is interesting relation between that receptor and that relation to vulnerability.
George.
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually about dosaging, because I was interested to hear what you have to say about microdosing. And whilst I think Ben earlier was saying, which is quite a compelling argument, that this macrodose of a larger hit actually brings about this shift, and I think if one's talking about PTSD, I can actually relate to that, and I think that's interesting. Is there a preference of why we're all talking about macro rather than smaller dosaging?
I think that the fascination from the full doses with this full fascinating variety of experiences that it brings along, that goes back many generations, thousands of years in some cultures, and the microdosing approach is much more novel. I mean, there is some evidence that maybe it has been tried, but it has been minimal. It's a very recent phenomenon, this sort of ritual, ceremonial use in some cultures of these compounds are related to these profound experiences that come from full doses. And so I guess the fascination and the appeal and the use have been related to these experiences that the full dose bring. But it of course somebody will then try different ways, and that is more recent. And I guess the jury is completely out. Just doesn't look super promising at this point. Some people will argue differently, but I would say that the arguments are at this point slightly vague, and because the studies that are showing great effects of microdosing overall are not of high quality at all, and not controlled, and the ones that have been controlled with acute experiences are not showing much of great interest yet. So, yeah. So
But there is a third way, as you remember him, don't you?
Psycholytic.
Yeah. So there is. It used to be that psychedelics, particularly LSD, was used in a psycholytic dose, or a lower dose. It didn't produce hallucinations, but did produce some perturbation, some alteration in one's sense of self, and that was used to facilitate psychotherapy. So I call that a MIDI dose now. And we're actually doing a MIDI dose study. This man is going to be doing the first MIDI dose study with psilocybin for people with OCD. And you might say, well, surely these people are... Sorry, I think this is my daughter bringing me again. Explain the study
Okay.
to them.
Yeah. So we are testing a psycholytic sort of medium dose of psilocybin in that trial. So where we're looking at flexibility and stuff like that to see whether it actually has an effect without having a full-blown psychedelic experience. So, but that's sort of a dose between what is used for microdosing and full dose. It's right in the middle. It's 10 milligrams psilocybin.
I mean, your 85-year-old lady who's never tried psychedelics,
Mm-hmm.
Might need a little bit of encouragement before, you're suggesting that she has this very large glass of medicine.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the OCD patient said. That basically, we said, you need a big dose to break these thought processes. And they said, well, we're not going to take it. Okay, well, and you can't, I mean, history tells us there were some experiments done in the 1960s in America giving people psychedelics against their will. Not a good outcome.
Yeah, and in the country I'm from, Denmark, they had some quite nasty experiments with very high doses and repeated and not proper consenting and people on their own and stuff. So yeah, you can obviously do this really wrongly. But yes, there is an appeal and that's the same appeal as developing compounds without the psychedelic experience that have some of the same pharmacology. If they have therapeutic action, then that will be appealing for a person who find it scary and way too much to actually surrender into such a full-blown experience. But it might just not be powerful enough, and maybe those transformative experience and that insight and that meaning and all these things that they produce with the subjective experience might be really pretty key for this transformative ability that they have with the full doses. But it will be tested and it should be tested, but yes, because it would be amazing if they actually would work without an experience to some degree for some people who are not up for the ride.
It sounds like you need to be up for the ride.
Yes, I would encourage that 75-year-old lady to go for it. Yeah, and actually in the DMT, so we had concerns about that people who were psychedelic naive, who had never tried a psychedelic, the first drug that they are exposed to is an intravenous bolus of DMT, quite high dose. So when we designed that trial together with the company who's running it, Small Pharma, we had all these discussions of because you could then, we can just do it in experienced users, but that doesn't make sense. If it's going to go out to the patients, it needs to be people who 90% should be naive in order to mimic the real population, and including the 75-year-old lady, that unless she was anyway, and therefore we try to sort of make it a more gentle coming up on the drug, so mimicking a bit an oral administration. So instead of having a bolus where you just shot out in the experience, then a bit more gentle. But that opens for other problems, because that means that people then have the ability of saying stop while you have infused half of the drug. That's not easy either. That opens other issues that is complicated to carry out. But yeah, so far it worked really well, I have to say, in all these healthy people that was done in that trial with different doses, with the IV DMT administration. People who were naive, they tolerated it well, and that they were not very psychedelic enthusiastic. They came from a normal list of potential volunteers for trials, so they were not the typical audience in our trials to some degree.
I also have a question on microdosing. So I understand that the past study shown that the placebo effect is almost as strong as right? So my question was, what do you think, what is actually the reason for it? So maybe it's not because microdosing is not as effective, but probably it's just because the placebo effect is so powerful that our brain is somehow able to activate the serotonin receptors without, like by convincing ourselves that we are under effect of microdosing. What do you think about that?
So whether that's mediated through the same mechanism in the two receptors, I really don't know, and I actually don't think so. And why is the placebo effect so pronounced? Because it's so hyped. I mean, if you take microdoses in the last 5 years, it's so super popular. You work in Google, you belong to cool, creative elite, you're stimulating your ability to think creatively, you are a bit against the conventional, medical model. Big pharma comes from nature, it comes from a spiritual world. It's just deeply appealing in this time in history. So you just have a whole list of reasons why it's so hyped. You have several bestsellers about how it changed people's life. You're just putting everything on the list of recipe for massive placebo, massive expectation. In order to engage in microdosing in most countries, it's illegal. You need to make an effort to get hold of the drugs. All that already make you very invested in it. You're the cool person at the Google headquarters. Probably all of them are cool then because they probably all do it. But I mean, I think that is what creates that placebo. It's if I just gave a person a random capsule of nothing and said this will make you super creative. You need the story, you need the narrative, you need the hype, you need. Yep. Yeah, you need that hype to create that expectation, and then you have the powerful placebo effect.
Your study confirms that placebo actually shown that the people improve, which means it works.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of studies in history have shown that placebo works. I mean, it just works well in all trials, depending on what you're studying. And I would say, with the cynical, medical, and not very psychedelic hat on, I would say, but in order for it to be interesting for regulators, for investors, for pharma, to be moving from an alternative space into conventional medicine and actually end up being licensed and prescribed, it needs to work more than placebo. And also it needs to have an efficacy of a certain size, and then having zero side effects is if it only has a very tiny efficacy. And if you need to treat many thousands to get one with a response beyond placebo, then it's just not interesting enough for the conventional medicinal world. And then you can say, is that a problem? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it can just stay as an alternative medicine and be carried by the placebo. But I'm not saying it's all placebo, because time will show, and bigger trials, correct trials, conventional trials, will show more. But
I do understand that for business, of course, it works the same way. But my question was more about, do you actually believe that our brain is capable of doing something? I mean, affecting serotonin receptors just based on pure belief rather than medicine?
Well, I think you might be, I think I have some sympathy with what you're saying. I mean, when people say to me, well, you can't blind a psychedelic experiment, can you? Because people know whether they've had a trip or not. And therefore, they then say, well, it's all placebo because they've had a trip, and therefore they know they've had a trip, and therefore it's a bigger placebo effect. And I think, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, but they want to get better, And maybe the serotonergic system is actually driving the ability to get better. Maybe it does have some role in the placebo effect. Maybe what we're doing is dramatically magnifying the placebo effect. But since half of all medicine is a placebo effect, that's not a bad thing to do. So if it gets people better, it gets people better. And we genuinely shouldn't be too negative about that. The only people that care about that, I suppose, are the people that care about selling drugs rather than about prescribing drugs like doctors.
Can you give us a little bit of insight between the relation psychedelics and age? I mean, the effectiveness of psychedelic on young adults against aging population is the same, or when we grow older, the brain shrink a bit, so the frontal cortex shrinks, so the effectiveness is the same?
I don't think there's been any. Many serotonergic systems seem to become less sensitive with age. So, but I don't know that's been formally studied with psychedelics, but it's been studied with other serotonergic agents. So the brain seems to become less responsive to serotonergic agents as you get older.
Psychedelics on older age, it would affect me less than.
I think so. That would be my guess. Do you think that's true, David, or not?
Yeah. I mean, the 2A receptor, the one that they work on mainly, that is decreasing with, I don't know, 10% per day. I don't remember exactly how much, but that's shown in several studies that does decrease. But the thing is, we don't even really know whether the level of that receptor is predictive of the effects, although it goes through that receptor. So that is a very simple way of looking at that might not explain. And whether in all our these surveys that the microdosing was one of, we actually we haven't looked enough on it and the age relation, and we could, because we have around 1,000 people we have all data. I think the age range probably is quite narrow. It's quite young people mainly, so we might not really have the range to really look at it. But it's a really good question, and I don't personally know enough. But we'll look more into our survey data to see if we can address it a bit from that at least, because it's an important question.
On the other hand, we do know that old people can sense psychedelics, because there was a very interesting study done a couple of years ago. It's not yet been written up, I don't think, but there did seem to be a relatively low dose of psychedelics did seem to have some vague mood-elevating effect in elderly people. So, yeah, I don't think they're immune to it, but you might not get as big an effect.
I imagine those end-of-life grief studies would be across a wider age range.
Yeah, true. And they were very powerful and had great results. And you're right, they must have been significantly older than in some of the other trials. Yeah, it's a good point.
Would they be taking bigger doses?
No, generally people don't take bigger doses because it's ethically really difficult to get permission to take a bigger dose, because as soon as you stat on the dose, a 25 milligram dose, to justify giving a bigger dose, is really ethics committee say, well, prove it's safe, and of course you can't without giving it. So it becomes a circular argument, so most of us just don't try.
I haven't even told you, but at a recent ethics meeting about the OCD trial with that 10 milligram dose, I exploited, I made, in the ethics meeting, I said, by the way, don't be shocked if we come back and show that people struggle with this dose, and then we are going to apply for double dose. Because I thought I might spend the time preparing them, because that will be weird. That's not normal, that if you have adverse events or people are really struggling with something, then you typically wouldn't go up in dose. But in a study like the OCD study with a low dose, that would be quite logical from what we know about psychedelics. But so I tried to prep them a bit on that possibility.
India.
You said earlier that people can only be helped if they really want to be helped. That's very specific to psychedelics therapy too. But I'm wondering about people who want to be helped, but naturally have resistance to the brain. Is there anything that you can do?
That's a great question. I mean, what is the resistance? We did really the first proper LSD imaging study, and to ensure that everyone got it, we gave it intravenously. LSD is a weird drug because it still takes as long to have an effect intravenously as it does orally, but at least we knew it was in them. But 2 people had no effect. No idea why. Maybe there's some genetic variant, how you could do anything about that? I doubt. Maybe you could, maybe some people metabolize it faster. There's a bit of evidence for that. Maybe you have to give a bigger dose. So there is individual variation, there's no question. But actually the larger individual variation is in the content and the nature of the experience, which it can be extremely variable, even with the same person. So in the second silent depression study, there's really no relationship between what the content of the first trip is and the second one. And somehow, it's extremely unclear as to whether you can make any predictions.
Maybe we can add that in the Copenhagen study that measured the occupancy, which is how much a given dose of psilocybin, in this case it was psilocybin, is sitting on this 2A receptor with PET imaging. And they basically found a really neat relationship between the dose and the intensity and the plasma levels and the occupancy on that receptor. It really perfectly fitted. So in a way, in that study there was an amazing relationship, but that between people variability we don't fully understand. But yeah, the breakdown, some people might metabolize it really quickly, but there seems to be a relationship between how much is in the blood, how much sits in that receptor, and how intense is it. And we can see relationships between the intensity and therapeutic outcomes, not in that study, but in all other studies. And by the way, it's the psychological peak or mystical type experience elements of the experience rather than perceptual changes that seem to be the better predictor of the outcomes.
So these medicines, they take you all to a pretty similar place, at least eventually. Can you get to the same place through deep, deep meditation?
Yeah, it just takes a long time.
Can you?
Well, so I'm not sure about the therapeutic outcomes because it takes too long to train people to get to that level of meditation skills. But soon after we published our first psilocybin imaging paper, we got an email from a guy called Jed Brewer from Yale, who's a world expert on the brain in meditation. And he said, "Why haven't you quoted our paper showing that meditation is exactly the same as psilocybin?" And we said, well, we had no idea. Why would we look at meditation papers? But it is true, particularly in the frontal regions, that the meditation and psilocybin are very, very similar in terms of their effects. But it does take a very long time. It may take decades to be able to train your brain to get to the same level as a psilocybin. Now, the group at Johns Hopkins has utilized psilocybin to facilitate people in learning mindfulness in meditation. And they've shown that you can actually, it can facilitate. So once you've got there with a psychedelic, you can practice getting there more and more with meditation. And that may be one of the reasons it works in conditions like depression, that people can get into a state where they're not depressed and they can keep rehearsing that non-depressed state in the same way as previously they were rehearsing the depressed state.
Well, I think you can all agree that that was an amazing panel. Thank you so much, Dave and David, for your time. And for your work, because it's really through this research and further clinical trials that we can pave the way for better treatments and standards of care for patients. So thank you so much for that, and for our audience and their fantastic questions. Thank you.